Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Mark Baumgartner. I'm the chair of the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, and the conference conveners asked us to put together a conservation highlight series for you on North Atlantic right whales. Just a bit about North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium is a group that curates a number of important databases that we monitor the species with, and we hold an annual meeting, which we had just on Sunday in Halifax. So to start, we have a wonderful panel here. You'll hear from Amy Knowlton from the New England Aquarium, Peter Corcoran from the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Scott Krause from the New England Aquarium, and Tanya Wimmer from MARS, the Marine Animal Rescue Society. I will just have just a few minutes. Each speaker's been given 5 minutes, and then most of this is going to be questions from you. So I'd like to start with a very simple calculation that scared the crap out of me, and I hope it scares the crap out of you too. So Richard Pace, Peter Corcoran, and Scott Krause put out a paper just a few weeks ago about the status of North Atlantic right whales, and they estimated that there were 458 right whales alive in 2015, which included 105 adult breeding females. And so if you do the math, that's 23% of the population. So in 2011, there were 481 right whales alive, and we keep a really close count on the number of calves that are born to this population. And there were 77 calves born between 2011 and 2015. So if there were no deaths, there'd be 558 whales alive today. But there aren't. There are 458, in 2015. There are 458 whales alive in 2015. So if you do the math, that's 100 deaths, and you divide by 5, that's 20 deaths per year. We don't observe 20 deaths per year, but that's what the actual mortality rate is. So if we apportion that mortality rate to the breeding females, that ends up to being about 4.6 breeding females that are killed every year. So if we say, how long will it take to kill off all the breeding females that exist today, we just divide those and we come up with 23 years. So what does that mean? If nothing changes, if we have the same calving rates that we do over this 5-year period, if we have the same mortality rates, we'll wipe out the 105 breeding females that exist today in just over 2 decades. So my take-home message from this is we have years, not decades, to fix this problem, and that the longer we wait, the harder the problem will be to fix. So I hope you come away from this conservation series with a sense of urgency and some hope for the species, given the solutions that we're going to discuss here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott Krause.
Alrighty, for those of you who have been living under a rock, you probably don't know that we have a really comprehensive catalog of North Atlantic right whales. As Mark already said, we have a quite robust population estimate now, 451, down over the last 6 years. But the catalog is the basis for almost everything that we do on right whales, and it's supplemented by data sets in genetics and tagging and the necropsy data and so on. So there's a whole variety of things that allow us to say with pretty good confidence that we see that we have a really good handle on a lot of the biology of this population. Now, starting in 2010, 2011, we started to see shifts in distribution, which have been a little bit startling to us. The circles along the east coast of North America in red represent actually areas that since that time the number of animals have declined seasonally, and the green areas are kind of new discovery areas or areas where the population or the regional aggregations have increased. The increases that are really startling are, of course, Gulf St. Lawrence in the summer times, areas south of Cape Cod in the winter and spring, and Cape Cod Bay itself in the winter and spring as well. Those are the big increases. The really precipitous drop-offs have been in the southeastern United States in the calving ground, and we've seen odd changes in distribution, very short residence times of animals in traditional summering habitats in the Bay of Fundy and in Rosaway Basin. Calving has dropped off in recent years, but actually the really important piece of this is that we've been seeing pretty steady growth in the number of adult females over time. I mean, we don't have a lot of adult females, but we have seen growth that you would expect in a growing population. The thing that's worrisome is that the percentage of adult females that are capable of giving birth are dropping off really dramatically, now down below 10%. And you can see in this graph, the red line represents the percentage of females giving birth, and there's a real drop off the cliff in 2010, 2011, up to 2012, that the animals really are not reproducing. One of the other things on the other side, I would say that on the mortality side, we've seen some increases in mortality that you might expect when you have a growing population. So part of this could be explained by that. But there are 2 points that are worth thinking about here, is that if you exclude the animals for which there were no necropsy results available, in other words, we didn't get to go out and collect the animals or they were too far gone to analyze. If you exclude those, the upper right-hand graph gives you a pretty good picture of the right whale causes of mortality when they've been examined. And there's a small component that is neonatal mortality, which I think is shown in green. And the 70-some% of the remaining animals are due to human activities, roughly equally divided between entanglements and ship strikes. Now, this is over all time, since 1970 or thereabouts. If you look at the lower central graph, one of the things that stands out is that the unexamined or unable to retrieve animals are in purple, and that number has increased in the last decade. The other thing that stands out about those last two columns is that the number of entanglement deaths have more than doubled between the 2 decades. One other point to make, and Richard Pace made this also in his presentation yesterday, is that our detection of dead whales, that is the animals that we see on the beach or floating and we retrieve or don't retrieve, but the animals that we identify as known to be dead are a small fraction of the animals that actually die. When you look at the animals that have disappeared from the catalog or are likely to die because of health assessment information, they are represented here by the purple bars and the orange bars. You can see that the actual number of animals that have been dying over the last 20 years is about twice what we're actually seeing on the beach. So, and I think Pace's data indicates it might even be more than that.
1 minute, Scott.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple of upbeat notes, which is that there are entanglement risk reduction options, and there are also shipping risk reduction options. And so we're not entirely without hope in this. I would say that there's a lot of, there's some rumble out there that, well, this species is toast, so let's just forget about it and move on. And in fact, what the data show is that if we could stop killing them, they live long enough, they have long enough reproductive lifespans, and they're resilient enough that they could come back. Thank you. Now next, I'm going to introduce Peter Corcoran, who's going to talk about some modeling work.
Bend that down. Thanks, Scott. Okay, so I'm going to talk. How does this go? There we go. Okay. So this is a figure that's starting to become famous. This is from the Pace et al. 2017 paper in Ecology and Evolution. And I'd like to make a couple of points about this. Is showing the trajectory of this species numbers over the past 25 years or so. And a couple of things worth bearing in mind, that back in 1990, there were only 270 of these whales. So there were less then than there are now. So, you know, there was 20 years where things got better. And then we picked a decline. And the other thing I'd like to point out about the decline is that, you know, we've been able to detect a decline of less than 30 over a few years in a marine mammal population of less than 500. And that should be impossible. And the reason it's possible, I mean, one thing is the magic of Bayesian inference and the fact that Richard Pace has the brain the size of a planet, but also it's due to the incredible work of all the people working on North Atlantic right whales over many years, not just doing the work, but also collaborating well together to make this happen. And I think that's really important to identify. And also to identify that this is a decline, okay? This is now published, and this is giving us more reasonable estimates of abundance, okay? The next point that I want to raise is that this is showing the species trajectory split by sex. And the thing to focus on is the females. And I remember when Richard first showed this figure, and we had this oh dear moment. And 458 or 451 now whales isn't that great, but 186 females is even worse. And why is this divergence happening? Well, because there must be a sex difference in mortality rates. And it's also worth bearing in mind, there are only 123 females back in 1990. Now there's in 2015, there were 186. And there are also 3 times during this period when female numbers actually dropped a bit. So whatever's happening, they're being affected more than the males are. And we're getting back to the point where we were 10 years ago at the moment. Okay, so what else can we pull out of trying to understand what's going on with females? This is a different approach using photo identification. For those who know, there are libraries. This one's BASTA. And this is showing survival curves for males and females. And what this shows is that, females are all dying off. They're all dead by the time they're in their mid-50s. And about half of them are dead sometime between 20 and 40. Okay? To put that in perspective, we know amongst the balenids that bowheads can live to at least, bows can live to 200 or so. And the other thing we know is that from some lucky information about one North Atlantic right whale, we know she was at least 69 when she died. We don't know actually how old she was, but she was at least that. And the other thing is that she died from ship strike, not from old age. So the other point about that figure is that the male's mortality is actually quite like female mortality for South African southern right whales from some work that Peter Best and colleagues did and published back in the late 1990s. As I said, females are all being dead by the time they're 50, and in fact, about half of them are dead at least by the time they're 30. And if you think about the whale who we know lived the longest, her lifespan's actually outside that curve. And yet we know she's a North Atlantic right whale, and she died early on in the time period when we would conduct of this study. She died in 95. Okay, so another way of looking at this is we construct a stage-based matrix model, and I've got 1 minute, so I'm going to be quick. And so this is classical Hal Caswell stuff. You've got females are born, they become juveniles, they become adults, they have babies. And running through, I don't have time to go through the details of the matrix model, but if we go through this, the intrinsic rate of increase of this species as it's lived for the past 25 years is an order of 2.5% a year, which is about what we saw. And that adult female survival is, as has been shown for 20 years, the most important contributor to this increase. So there should have been 186 females, well, when there were 186 females in the species, there should have been in the order of 100 to 110 adult females. That's where that 105 females number comes from. And there should be in the order of 11 female calves, so 22 calves born each year. And these animals should be living till they're sort of almost 30. And with that, I'll pass it on over to Amy.
Right, so as Scott alluded to, there are 2 issues facing right whales, which are ship strikes and entanglements. Fortunately, we've got a pretty good handle on the ship strike issue, except for this year in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but Tanya will talk a little bit about that. So I'm not going to go into the ship strike issue. We basically have speed restrictions and rerouting measures as options there. But the entanglement is just a huge emerging, continuing to emerge crisis, as I'm going to talk about here. How do I, oh, just the green, okay, sorry. So we've been measuring entanglement rates for a long time now, and we've measured them since 1980 to the present, but what we've been doing more recently is looking at the severity of entanglement scars as well. We've also been looking at the configuration risk of entanglements, low risk being limited amount of gear, no trailing gear, and high risk with multiple wraps and lots of trailing gear. We've also been doing health assessments to just get a handle on how their health corresponds to the entanglement detection. And I'm not going to go into all the results of this work because but there are a number of papers that are out there that are summarizing this work. So what we've learned from the health work is that, combined with the severity of the injuries and whether they're carrying gear or not, is you can see that as injury severity increases, the health compared to the rest of the population declines. And that sort of makes sense. But what was more alarming about this is that the impact on reproductive females is much greater than the other demographic groups. And that's leading to impacts on calving rates and could be leading to the population decline that we're now seeing. Now, when we look at entangled whale carcasses shown here in black, there are only 20 cases where we have carcasses on the beach that we related back to entanglements. But when you look at the health of individuals and then those that disappear that had severe scars or were last seen entangled alive, you have more than double that number, 51 cases of whales that have disappeared or disappeared from entanglement. And I'm not showing it in this graph, but we have another 141 cases of whales that are presumed dead, not seen in 6 years. And we know that some proportion of those whales are likely due to entanglement mortality. And one little tidbit that makes us believe that that's the case is that 25% of the entangled whale cases were only seen on one day, and they were either dead with gear or last seen with attached gear and never seen again. The whale I showed in my first slide is one such case of that. So we know that they're dying at a much greater rate than we actually detect. But what we also see is starting in 2011, we're seeing a much higher number of these whales that are either dead or we know are likely to die from entanglement. And also, just to summarize the last 5 years, we've had 7 entangled carcasses plus 2 in 2017, 19 live entangled whales plus another 7 in 2017, and then 24 whales that, with severe injuries that we know are likely to die from their events. So that's 50 cases in just the past 5 years, not including 2017. So it's just an escalating problem, which we can see are having its impacts. The question is, why is there this temporal issue going on? And we did a study looking at rope strengths from entangled whales, and we also looked at rope strength over time, and you can see here with these 3 different diameter ropes that the rope strength has dramatically increased, especially since the 1990s. And so as the work we did on the 70 whale cases with attached gear and rope strength, we determined that a rope strength of 1,700 pounds or less would reduce the severity of entanglements. So we believe that the potential solutions to this issue are to make all gear throughout the right whale's range safe, or at least safer for whales. Ropeless fishing is certainly the best approach for eliminating this problem, and there is work going on by my colleague Tim Werner, and folks at WHOI are working on this, and there are others I know here that have started addressing this question. Also, Scott Krause did a study that showed red or orange ropes could right whales see red and orange better, and they would therefore avoid that colored rope more at a greater distance. We mentioned the whale release ropes, 1,700 pounds or less, and I did a talk yesterday that showed that fishermen can actually haul, in many instances, can haul their gear with ropes of this reduced strength. Not in all cases, but in vast areas where gear is dense, that could probably work. And these should complement other measures that are already in place or being considered, such as closures, trawling up of gear, sinking ground line, a variety of measures that the U.S. has certainly tried. So I think there are ways to move forward, and we just have to start putting them into place quickly. Thank you. And here's Tanya from Mars.
So much shorter. Hi, I don't think I need to introduce myself, actually. The one thing I would say, too, is I've actually thoroughly enjoyed being up here for most of this conference. Not right now. Because what I'm going to tell you about is the situation that occurred in 2017 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And the first thing I want to say is that this is based on an awful lot of work by so many people, especially our incredible veterinary team from the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, Pierre-Yves Daou, Laura Bork, Emily Couture, as well as so many others, and so much support and advice from people throughout Canada, the US, international, everywhere. It really was a truly collaborative effort, and that was needed. So just to give you an idea, in case, as like Scott says, you lived under a rock this year, Gulf of St. Lawrence here on eastern Canada, you are located just under the word Nova Scotia right now. We had a situation that lasted between June 6th through to July 21st, and then with another little surprise in mid-September. Now, I'm going to go through the next few slides fairly quickly, just to show you the individual animals, because I want you to not just see what happened, I actually want you to see who we're talking about, because they actually aren't just numbers. The thing I would mention here, too, is that the information we have on these animals, their identifications, their ages, and when we last saw them that you'll see here, are because of the amazing team at the New England Aquarium for identifying these individuals because of that amazing catalog that exists. So just quickly, first animal was on June 6th, like I said, and all of these animals were found dead floating at sea by a variety of amazing people out there with Coast Guard and transport and NOAA planes and ships and things like that. So our first animal was a male in June 6th. We had a little bit, this animal actually, we weren't able to retrieve it and it was later lost. And then we had a period of quite a few all in the same stretch of time, but a little bit later, this was later in June, we had another male, and then another male. And then we had our first female, which turned out to be a whale called Starboard, and she was quite complexly entangled in fishing gear, and I'll tell you a little smidge about that. She was actually in snow crab gear, and at least several sets of that gear with several traps. We had another female, which we actually tripped across accidentally. We were going out to look for the other ones and came across this one and realized it was a totally new animal. This animal, we were able to get a few samples at sea, but then after that, she was later lost again. And then it keeps going. Another animal a little later in June, and then we had a small little window of reprieve and had another dead male in early July, and then another dead male named Peanut, which I think almost killed me when the name was told to us. Another male that was found floating in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So of those first 8 animals that we had during this period, we actually lost 2 of them at sea. We never physically were able to get the carcass basically onto shore. Right after this, we had 4 carcasses that actually washed up on western Newfoundland. And the amazing team there with DFO and Parks Canada were able to run around and run around. This was crazy where it was spread out in some of them very remote areas. But they did that to get some photos and to get samples, actually, and especially finger bones for genetics, because the animals were so decomposed, we couldn't really use photos to compare. What we were trying to figure out is if any of these animals were some of our missing ones. And then we got the surprise animal in mid-September, and it was interesting. We were in the middle of writing up this giant report, and literally this happened the day we heard about it the day before we were all going to meet to finish this report. So we had another female and a really young one, she was only 2, that was found dead as well. Of course, during this time, we also had 5 live entangled whales that were also observed during this period, most entangled in snow crab. 2 of these were disentangled by Joe Howlett and the team there, and 1 shed the gear on its own, and 2, there was no response allowed, and we don't know yet what happened with them. So just as a summary, this is just to show you exactly what happened. I will say that because of the photographic work and the genetics, we were able to confirm there were 12 animals. Only 1 of our missing animals turned out to be one of the ones in Newfoundland. All the rest were new. So we do have that number, and then the 5 live ones. And mostly actually males, some females, and one was unknown, one of the entangled animals we didn't know, and they range from 2 to 37 at least. So the big question really was, what do we do? And really, the big thing was to bring as many ashore as we could. And we did, and I would say DFO did a phenomenal job getting these carcasses to shore. And it's not easy. These are big animals. So in general, what happened over the course of just over 3 months, we did 7 necropsies on those animals in 3 different provinces. We did 2 in Prince Edward Island, the little island in the middle there. The tinier island, we did 2 of them, 3 in PEI, and 2 individual necropsies in northern New Brunswick. And this was insanity. It was crazy, it was insane, it was exhausting, it was heartbreaking, it was awful. But we had one heck of a team, I must say. We had between 20 to 40 people on each necropsy, and people who dropped everything. And everything from the West Coast dropped everything and showed up. From Bill McClellan came up from the US on the long weekend and the holiday in July. So it was phenomenal. Yeah. A lot of stuff, basically complete necropsies. They did extensive sampling, all kinds of information. We have a report on this. That was the URL at the beginning I forgot to mention. We looked at the gear that was on the animals, collected it. People can have a look at that. It still exists. And the big thing really is that, in the end, we had 12 animals that were dead, 5 that were entangled. 2 of them did die from entanglement and fishing gear. We had 4 where the findings suggested blunt trauma, which means a vessel. And we had 1, it was inconclusive, but there was some suggestion of blunt trauma. No other underlying conditions in terms of emaciation, biotoxins, whatever. The other thing I will add to this is that right before this and a little bit during, there have been 3 in the US, and then as of yesterday, there was another. So we're at what, 16? Yeah, I think I'm gonna leave that one there.
So that was a very quick overview of right whales. So we'd like to open it up for questions, comments, whatever you like. We're here to answer your questions. There are microphones up front, so please.
I just have a question about fishing effort compared to increase in entanglement.
Yeah, I think in general, fishing effort has expanded probably in most areas of the coast, especially the northeast US and the Gulf St. Lawrence. I know the snow crab fishery doubled their quota this summer, and they extended their season a bit longer than their usual season. I don't know the exact details. I think their season usually starts in April when the ice goes out, and this year it extended into July, but I think usually it ends a bit earlier than that. So, and I think it's a relatively new fishery in terms of like maybe in the past couple of decades. So it's not, so in terms of snow crab, it's a newish fishery compared to for example, the lobster fishing on the East Coast. But lobster fishing has also expanded offshore over the decades, so.
Well, at the risk of sounding like a real dumbass, perhaps you could enlighten us, but what do you recommend we do?
So for ship strikes, there are basically 2 options: move shipping lanes or slow ships down. We have fairly good evidence that the lethality of ship strikes is reduced when large ships are going 10 knots or less. It's not reduced to 0. That solution we think has worked well on the east coast of the United States, where seasonal management areas are in place to reduce the speed of ships to below 10 knots in certain areas, and the ship strike mortalities have decreased since the adoption of that rule in 2008. For fishing gear entanglements, your options are closures, gear modification, and the gear modification consists of exactly what Amy said: the adoption of reduced breaking strength rope or the development of ropeless fishing. Ropeless fishing doesn't really exist right now, so there's going to be a development period. So it requires a significant amount of investment and a very rapid development process. But those are our options. Those are the options that are on the table right now.
Not so much a question as a statement. I know bringing in the stakeholders for fishing and for shipping is a very extensive and long drawn-out process. But one suggestion would be, because focusing just on fishing, to actually get each of the individual fisheries, because they are so different from each other, at a different table and working with them simultaneously together at different tables to speed this process a little bit faster than what we know is going to happen.
Yeah, that's a point well taken. We understand that each region, each fishery is probably going to require a slightly different approach. So that's well understood here.
I appreciate your talk and all the work you people have been doing. What you were describing about these incidents this summer have been mainly in Canadian waters, and the Canadian government's going to have to do a bunch of the reforms to ameliorate that. A lot of the people here at the conference are from that other country down south, and I don't know if you have any particular advice about what Americans might do, and if you could, someone could address what's been happening in the wintering grounds off Florida and Georgia, and because I think that one of the first slides talked about there being a decline in the population there, whether that's whales that are moving or what are the issues down there?
I don't know why they all looked at me. Can you hear me? Yeah. So in the last 5 years, the numbers of animals that have shown up off the southeastern United States have declined precipitously, as well as sort of concurrently with the decline in calving. The National Marine Fisheries Service did a certain series. They banned some types of fisheries in the southeast, and they've instituted weak ropes for certain fisheries down there that are actually much lower than the 1,700-pound breaking strength that we're recommending for the rest of the fishery. So they've taken quite a few actions. Not a lot of fisheries in the winter months down there, so we have not worried about that so much. Most entanglements seen down in the southeast have actually come from elsewhere, including the Gulf of Maine and Canada.
I'm a little concerned. Looking at the panel, with the exception of Tanya, it's primarily American interests, and I'm concerned that you're talking about a Canadian problem. Where are the Canadian representatives to discuss a Canadian problem?
Well, actually, I think that this has kind of caught the Canadian representatives a little bit by surprise this year. And secondarily, my view is that right whales don't give a damn what country they're in, and we need to be addressing this on a transboundary basis across all countries. So.
Thank you. I'm just concerned that the perception is that it's going to be U.S. telling Canadians what they should or shouldn't be doing. Thank you.
If I may, it's important to remember that while there was a disaster in Canada this year, there's been an ongoing disaster going on in the United States for many years. We don't have to go back many years to tally up as many U.S. caused deaths in right whales as happened this summer in Canada. So Scott's right, this is a transboundary issue.
And if I might add, sorry, if we actually knew something about what to do, then I would say, yeah, well, we could offer something, but we don't. So we have failed over 20 years of take reduction teams and efforts to manage kills in the United States to actually make an indent that showed any inflection point in the mortality rates. So it would be the last thing of anyone on this panel to presume to lecture the Canadians about what to do.
I was just wondering if there's been any thoughts about putting sort of social pressure on the fisheries, sort of the same way that tuna has dolphin safe or bycatch safe products, if snow crab and lobster and anything else could sort of get the same incentive of, you know, using the new technology or using the breakaway lines, and then sort of get that social pressure beyond Oceanwise Watch or things like that, just as maybe a way to incentivize the public to sort of participate in this sort of conservation in a way that you don't have to be a marine scientist to do.
I mean, my feeling is that we do have some mechanisms to do that, and we are starting discussions with Marine Stewardship Council about their metrics of evaluating endangered species, marine mammals. We are starting dialogue with the snow crab fishery, and we are, you know, there's been a lot of dialogue in the U.S. with the fishing industry there, but I think we have a window of opportunity here where things have gotten so much worse in such a short time that we're hoping that maybe by dialogue and providing some solutions that would allow them to continue fishing, that maybe we wouldn't have to try to do things like boycotts or something that would impact their business. I mean, I think our hope is to find solutions that will work for them and work for the whales. But I think getting the public engaged in that is very important.
Public engagement is probably most important to put pressure on our respective governments to do something about it. It's not having the public put pressure on the fishermen. It's putting in place transparent processes by which we can solve these within government, and those don't really exist right now. And there's been a lot of press on this in Canada, and we can see the effect that has on the process. So we're hoping that happens in the U.S. as well.
I'd like to get a couple of numbers from Peter, and then I have something to say.
Speak up, Chris.
I'd like to get a couple of numbers from Peter, and then I have something to say.
I'm shocked.
I would like to know the population size estimate now and the female number estimate now. Just two numbers, please.
For the end of 2016, it was 451. Pace, do you know what the females for was? 2015, I can tell you, was 186 females. So it'll be, yeah, so it'll be slightly less than 186.
Yeah, but
Okay,
subtract 11 for this year.
Okay.
Right? And you can subtract 4 adult females from that 105.
Okay, give me a number. 100? 170? Okay, let's say population size about 450, females is about 170. I am highly recommending that the press, the media, and every person in this room never use that word 450 again and use the number 170.
No, they should use 100. That's the number of breeding females.
Oh, well, even better. What an unmitigated disaster. So the number we should be using is 100 breeding females. I don't care about the others. The whole future of the population is in the 100. It's not in the 450. So get it right, media. Get it right, scientists. And don't talk to me about whales chasing food.
So, thanks, Chris. And that's why I make a point about the female numbers. I mean, it's of course hard to say as a bloke that, you know, we don't count, but in this instance, we just, you know, the males just don't count. You know.
Hi, this is a question for Tanya, but also to our American colleagues. So it's a lot of recommendations are out there in terms of change in legislation and change in management, but I'm wondering if you can comment on the challenges of enforcement.
For ship strikes or fishing gear entanglements, or both?
Both. Fishing entanglements particularly.
Yeah, the ship strike stuff is pretty straightforward because AIS is required on everything over 65 feet, is that right? Yeah. So you can actually monitor them from the comfort of your bedroom. The fishing gear enforcement piece is actually quite tricky. There's various sorts of enforcement strategies for both countries have different ones, and there's various sorts of enforcement strategies for dockside inspections. But in the United States, and I don't know what the story is in Canada, but in the United States we have very little shipboard inspections because the Coast Guard is charged with a whole variety of things, safety at sea, homeland security, and somewhere down the list comes fisheries enforcement. And they do the best they can, but there's not a lot of it. So the other thing is that what is it that you're going to enforce? One of the reasons that we're having so much opposition at the government level to ropeless fishing is that what is it that they're enforcing? They can't see the gear at the surface. They would need to have some sort of electronic detection system for an acoustic transponder on the bottom. And that's a whole technology and a cultural shift in both the fishing industry and the regulators. And there's a lot of reluctance to change the way business is done.
I'd also like to point out that this is not like the vaquita. Whales are not dying because of illegal fishing. They're not dying because of illegal gear configurations. They're dying from getting entangled in completely legal gear.
Sorry, and just to add that for the Canadian, it's the same situation that the observer coverage on fleets varies, and in some it's almost zero. The other thing that's very hard is that even for some of those observers, these big whales aren't sitting in the gear often when they are out observing either. Not like when you see a porpoise come up in a net. Often they've picked it up and it's gone, and they've never even observed the actual thing happening. So it makes it very hard to even get the numbers, I'd say.
Hi, Rich Riles, Director of Smelts, and we've been developing lineless crab gear, lobster gear. We've been having very good success with the technology. And basically what I'm asking is, we need to partner. This is a major problem. We need to get together with basically everybody involved, including the fishermen. I want to get on their boat, see their challenges, see what they're having problems with. How can our lineless technology help them? What problems are they going to see with this technology? So all of us have to collaborate now at this point, and there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of challenges, but we could bring this technology to the fishermen. If there's going to be money available to try to get this out, let's give it to the fishermen. Let's work on these challenges. Let's find out how we can spot it in the ocean. Let's see how we can see it when it's at the surface. These are just engineering challenges. I am an engineer, so I look at things a little bit differently than a biologist or a scientist. It's a problem, I try to solve it. So my question to you guys is, how can we collaborate? I'm from the States, but this is a problem that is transboundary, and it's not just here. We're talking Mexico, up to Alaska, all other parts of the world. And if we can start right here, right now, and start making some kind of groundwork for this, this could spread globally and reduce problems everywhere else. And really, just how can we come together on this, as you guys as the experts, to help a guy like me, a little guy, that's saying, hey, we can do it a different way. Let's look at it a whole different way. And this technology is available, and we take those technologies and we separate them, but when you combine them together, they can be very powerful. Thank you.
I wouldn't disagree with anything you said, but I also would suggest that you not wait for us. Go find fishermen and work on the problem, because this has to happen fast. What's lacking right now is investment. What's holding ropeless, the development of ropeless technology back is investment. By government or private, whoever, we need the funds. The ideas are there, as you have very nicely shown. The ideas are there. Having a prototype is not having something that an entire fishery can use. There's a process in between that has to be funded, and we're a long way from that. So investment.
Hello. I'm going to go back to the enforcement piece. I was wondering if there's any prosecution protocol. Anybody that's looking at AIS tracks and looking up these ships' MIMSIs and starting an investigation on this ship was here around the same time as this known location of a whale death?
Well, there is quite a bit of work done in the United States to, to enforce ship speeds throughout the speed zones. In terms of connecting it to an actual whale case, I think there have been efforts to do that. We're not always privy to those investigations, law enforcement investigations, but I do know there is always an effort to try to do as much as can be done by doing drift analysis of the whale back to where it might have been struck and seeing what the vessels were going through. So in the U.S. it's done.
Well, and I know this summer when they put in, oh good, and the person I was going to point to should talk about it, but this summer when they did put in the first the voluntary and then especially the mandatory speed rules in that particular area in Canada, they did issue fines, if someone was going faster when they went through, but Taggart probably knows a lot more about it than I do. Go ahead, Taggart.
We did a study 3 weeks into the mandatory closure, measuring the speed outside the zone, measuring the speed inside the zone, and measuring speed to the other side of the zone. And the compliance by vessels at 10 knots or less was 98%. There were 6 violators. 3 of them had a speed of 10 plus or minus 0.3 knots. Every study we've done with the shipping industry shows that they will and can comply.
Is Michael coming to us? Oh, crap. He's going to have something ready, and I don't know what it's about.
Just to go back to the enforcement question, if we do achieve a ropeless situation, the enforcement of the use of rope will be really easy. If they're leaving the dock with rope on the boat, it's not. So, the question of you need to have the end line buoy so that you can enforce is irrelevant in that situation. And the other comment I'd make is that the double whammy of entangled females chronically is not only do they risk dying, they're basically, for the duration of their time swimming with gear and the impacts thereafter, they're dead whales swimming because they cannot get pregnant or risk not being able to get pregnant for that whole period. So it's both sides of the coin, and it's really important to understand that because it doubles the impact essentially.
Every adult female that we kill is that whale's death and all of the calves that she could have had. So the loss of an adult female is particularly troubling for the survival of the species.
Yeah, this isn't a question, it's just a comment to everybody in the room. Jim Scarf asked earlier what people can do. We have a huge regulatory challenge ahead of us in Canada and in the US. Even if we had ropeless technology that we could put on the boats first thing tomorrow morning, there is a regulatory challenge to change the Canadian Fisheries Act to allow changes in what they call gear marking schemes. One example is there's a fishery in Grand Manan, Bay of Fundy, that's going to start soon. They're prepared to reduce their end lines by 50% in case there's any right whales in the area, but they are not permitted to do so under the Fisheries Act of Canada and have been told so by DFO. So there is a lot of room for going to your respective governments and really helping push this regulatory change once we get the technology in place.
I'm going to close it unless anyone has anything. Okay. Thank you, Mo. That's a great point. So it's just about 1:30. I believe the sessions are going to start up again. So thank you all very much for coming. We greatly appreciate it.